In the season finale of Agile Giants, I am thrilled to welcome Andrew Giessel, Executive Director of Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at Moderna. Andrew and I first crossed paths when Moderna's AI Academy was launched in collaboration with CMU. I was one of the co-directors of that program from the Carnegie Mellon side, and I can attest to the incredible work he's been doing at Moderna. Andrew has been at the forefront of data science and AI for quite some time, and his involvement hasn't stopped with this current generative AI revolution. He played a critical role in quickly helping all of Moderna start incorporating generative AI into their workflows through a tool he conceived and launched called mChat. I'm excited for you to join us in this engaging discussion on Agile Giants. Enjoy. So Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we get to Moderna, it's probably worth giving just a little bit of your background and your context. Could you talk just a little bit about your academic and professional background before coming to Moderna?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. So I've been at Moderna for almost 8 years. It'll be 8 years on Leap Day, which I joked with someone. And does that mean I've been there for 2 years or 8? And it's like definitely been 8 years. So before that, I worked at a friend's tech startup. It was very small, as me and 2 other folks, basically. And that was on like mobile phone sensors. And then before that, I was a postdoc in academics. So I did my PhD and my postdoc in neurobiology at Harvard Medical School. Worked in mice mostly, did experiments that were like a combination of electrical recordings and videos through a microscope. So I always had to use computers to analyze my data. And that's kind of, I guess, where I started to turn into a data scientist. Before that, before grad school, I was a computer science and biochemistry major. I did both. I went into college as a computer science major and left also like I'm studying biology as well. So I've kind of done both. And when I got to Moderna, I felt like it was a great place for me because there's this mix where I knew my tools really well, but I could also have a lot of deep and meaningful conversations at a technical level with a lot of my collaborators that were biologists or chemists or whatever else.
Right. So everybody's familiar with Moderna today, but certainly probably, I mean, just for people remembering, 8 years ago, there's a very small company that had not had the brand recognition. So you've been there. What employee number were you in Moderna?
My class contained employee 300.
Perfect.
So at that time, there were like, I don't know, handfuls of people joining every week. And in general, the company is like not exactly doubled every year, but almost. By the time we got to the pandemic, we were around 700 people. That's how big we were when the pandemic started, which is kind of crazy when you compare us to, say, like Pfizer, who have 100,000 employees. It's like a really different sort of game. So yeah, I think the early stages of Moderna were really, there was a lot of excitement about the technology. I joined because of the basic premise of Moderna, which is that if you can get it to work, if you can get mRNA to work once, you basically can get it to work over and over again because it's the information that is basically the drug and not the not the entire product. The product is basically kind of physically the same, but the information is different, which is really compelling. Yeah,
it's an amazing vision, and I think that kind of leads to the other part of context setting before we get into what you're doing, right? Which is you would have to have literally been living under a rock to not know the name Moderna today, but people may not be quite as familiar with the data science and AI part of Moderna. You're kind of starting to speak to that, but just a moment on kind of even at that early days, why do they have a data science team like yourself, and what does data science and AI mean at Moderna?
Yeah, broad question, but I mean, I was the first data scientist we hired. We had a couple of other computational people at the time, but they were kind of more traditional bioinformaticists or computational chemists. I think data science has always been there. I guess since I've been there, it's kind of obvious maybe, but now we probably have a community of 20 to 30 data scientists. And the notion of mRNA as a platform has a lot of consequences for the company as a whole, right? So if you have the same raw materials to make to make DNA, to make RNA, then you're probably going to run into some of the same sort of problems over and over again. No matter what the product does, it's still like you're still making DNA, you're still making RNA. And so that motivated us to invest in sort of digital technology and data science from an early stage because it pays off, right? So I have code that I wrote that's been in production since 2016 that was used in a very small way to help design the COVID vaccine. And it wasn't written for the COVID vaccine. It was written for just making DNA plasmids generally. But then it gets reused and, then I get this claim to fame. But I think my teams over the years have had stories like that over and over and over again, where we do it initially for one problem, but it was prioritized or, we were excited about it from a value perspective because we knew that it would be used over and over again.
Yeah. So, okay. So rather than continue to kind of keep this general, the fascinating, I just would say that beyond that 20 or so in your community, there's always been this vision of pushing these tools out to everybody in the organization. And I want to click on the generative AI stuff that you're doing specifically and mChat. So maybe to start with, what's the idea behind mChat and how has it affected kind of workflow use since it launched in May of last year?
I've really not been a part of a technology that's moved so quickly and had such a sweeping sort of change. Just generally in, the tech world and society, but also at Moderna. So mChat was an internally deployed version of ChatGPT, basically. Underneath the hood, it used OpenAI APIs to talk to their large language models, but we were able to expose it internally. From a security point of view, this is really important because at the time, OpenAI didn't have a good way for you to guarantee that your conversations wouldn't be used in future training of the models. But everything over API was guaranteed to be was guaranteed to not be included in training. And so that was a really big deal for us as a business to make sure that our data was secure and safe. And so we launched it internally, and it just kind of took off with a life of its own. I mean, kind of in parallel to ChatGPT. I think it was, GPT-4 was really capable in a way that, 3.5 is good, obviously good too, but 4 felt like a bit of it crossed some sort of threshold in capability. And so mChat came on the back of that, and we basically use GPT-4 by default. By now, 75% of the company has used it. 50% of the company is monthly active users, and we only give devices out to 75% of the company, right? 25% of the people on the manufacturing floor don't get phones or laptops, right? So essentially, it's had complete penetrance, and people are, people use it all the time. You walk through the office, you see it up on screens, and it's pretty remarkable. The team we had super small, right? It's 4 or 5 software engineers. Initially, it was just me. I was happy that we got some engineers in before it really, really took off. But yeah.
Sure. So how do you think, so I mean, for what it's worth, I think everybody's been trying to figure out what to do with large language models and generative AI, but a lot of orgs don't have the same adoption rates that you just rattled off. Effectively 100% trying it out, 100% of possible audience trying it out, and 2/3 using it because it's 75 and 50, but 75 is 100. That's, what do you attribute to this, uniquely significant adoption of mChat inside Moderna?
Yeah, I think there's both sort of an atmosphere of excitement and just trying it out. Like we hire people that would probably be likely to try it out, or at least we try to. I think the other is that I have a partner, Bryce Chalamel, who's head of AI transformation, and he's just a dynamo and like has done extensive outreach. And I've been with him at a lot of these town halls where we talk about it. We've thought about, different personas and the uses that they have. And I think that's been a huge part of it. He also established a group called GACT, the Generative AI Champions Team, which is GACT are also the letters of DNA. So it's like very, very clever.
That is
and these are essentially like power users across the company, and they span all different business units. They tend to skew younger and more junior, but these people are avid users and just like kind of constantly surprise us with all the different sort of stuff that they do. I think that building that sort of community, the team's site, our internal blogs, there's just a lot of outreach effort to make it click for people. And I think it takes some of that to make it sink in. But once it does, I find that people just like, it's like a phase transition. They're suddenly like, I couldn't live without this tool. In my sort of part of the company, I'm pretty close to a lot of folks that program. I would think its use for programming is amazing. We use both mChat, but then also we have a enterprise GitHub account and use GitHub's Copilot, which has a different flavor. It's more like, the best autocomplete you could hope for, whereas mChat is more like, I have this bigger problem. Can you, or this code doesn't work. Can you walk me through it? Right? It's more conversational. Those are definitely two different styles, but they're both, generative AI and both things that we have rushed towards. Copilot has been out for a while, but it was actually a change in their terms of service where they guaranteed that they wouldn't use any information sent to them to improve their models that triggered us to be able to pick it up. And one of my data science leads and I did a back of the envelope calculation for our data scientists about how much time that tool saved. And we estimated roughly an hour a day per data scientist, which is crazy. I think it really varies how much you're in the trenches doing individual contributor work. But when it works well, it really feels like you're flying. And I think programming is a really good sort of, it's a really killer app for it, in part because, and we've talked about this before, this technology really shines when it is faster to verify a solution than it is to crank out the first draft of it.
That's right. That's right.
And when you, and programming, when you code, you kind of have a little code simulator running around in your head all the time. That's like part of the essence of programming, I think. And so developers are very much in that mode where they are looking at their code and wondering why it doesn't work. They can look at something else's code and wonder if it works or not, but it's pretty effective there. And it feels like you're flying when it works well.
Yeah, I think the other part of it is when it hallucinates, it literally internally can compile and see that it hallucinated, which is probably a helpful mental model for other creation activities. Like how do you have some type of closed loop check on hallucination? Like if it just makes up a function and the code errors, Copilot from GitHub can actually see that happen. Whereas, if you're writing an email and it makes up a date, that's harder out of the box to test for hallucination.
Yeah. I think one of the remarkable things I've found, and one of the things I would say, intermediate tips that we have given people across the company is to iterate with these models, right? And so there's a study looking at the kind of one-shot performance of code generation of GPT-4. And if it didn't work and you just pasted the error back in, you got like a 20% jump in like overall accuracy.
Yep.
And I think that's really remarkable. There's not, I think it's a good metaphor, but I think often people can struggle to do the analogous things in these non sort of quantitative outputs, right? Or like image generation. How do you, I guess you can ask it to change something about the image or something. It's a different type of evaluation, but that like loop of going back and forth with the model, is a really different way of using a computer for sure.
Yeah.
Right? It's yeah.
I'll give like one example, which is like, I'll often have ChatGPT generate kind of a unique competitive landscape, right? Like, here's a startup, help me understand the competitors around it. And the danger there is it will just make up startups that aren't real with like really credible names, really credible URLs that look like would be the right URL for that name. And so I've written a little bit of Python code that basically takes that URL, loads it into a web scraper, and compares, first of all, if it just, the URL doesn't exist, you can be pretty confident to call that a hallucination.
Uh-huh.
But if it does, like, is the text that loads similar to the text that you were expecting? And, GPT 3.5, it was about 50% of the results that came back were hallucinations. GPT-4, it's like 8 out of 10 are good. But in some ways that makes the 2 out of 10 even harder because now you really got to be paying attention. But,
yeah, definitely.
But like, it's actually like a similar analogy to the compile, right? Like now I've got, and if you have it bring it, you can also ask GPT to respond as JSON. So it's pretty easy to then take that and loop through it.
I've done a similar thing with, or had a similar experience trying to use it to research topics and ask for papers on a topic.
Yes. Yeah.
I did this and I got these incredibly like relevant papers. Like I was like, how have I not read this before? And the reason I hadn't read it before is because it didn't exist. But it was like people I recognized, titles that made sense, journals,
right?
Like, but all fake, right?
Yeah.
And I've said this before internally. These models aren't trained to be right; they're trained to be likely. And that is a very subtle difference. It often overlaps with our notion of correct, but they are not. There's certainly no guarantee, right?
Yeah, my brother-in-law's on the faculty at Penn in their biomechanical engineering department there, and he was telling me he got this email this summer from a student looking to join his lab. And he was like, it was just this amazing email citing all the stuff I had done. And I was like, I don't remember doing those 2 papers though. And then it hit him that like someone had gone to ChatGPT and said like, how do you approach Joel Burkle? And it came up with a great answer, except for 2 of the 5 studies were completely made up, but exactly the kind of thing he would have done. So it was, it's a weird word. And that this likely versus correct, I think is a thing that people are still figuring out.
Yeah. I mean, these models are so capable in so many ways that I think it makes me at least kind of reconsider certain aspects of like the way that I think or the way that my job works, right?
Yes.
If a model can bang out, text for an email, a memo, or a PowerPoint, and it's great. I'm like, did I need to be writing that email, memo, or PowerPoint? Like, I don't know, And then also, in terms of like how much of my day-to-day life is, contingent on me having good mental models and acting on those mental models when I actually don't have the evidence, kind of like in a Bayesian sense, like having good priors,
right,
and being able to work on it. Like, how often do I do that? And how, how much do I depend on that actually? Maybe more than I think a lot of us do that, maybe more than we should, or more than we'd be willing to admit if we looked at it hard.
Yeah, 100%. It's that paper that we were texting about this weekend with the AlphaGo thing. Like, I'm still internalizing that, but like this sort of, oh, when you have this at your capability, how it changes what's possible is a thing I think that is, it's really interesting. It's the future of work, basically. And
I think, yeah, definitely. I kind of touch on that a little bit more, but the paper is, roughly speaking, it analyzed, 70 plus years of Go games and found the shift in the quality of moves and the novelty of moves after AlphaGo, and those sorts of models became commonly used. And I think the novelty of the moves is really is probably the more interesting thing.
100%.
I think having it as a study tool to be able to be like, oh, there's this thing that I couldn't see, but now I can see it, or it's like someone pointing out something to you. Well, I think the more or less the way that they analyzed the novelty of the moves is they basically compared moves that didn't match the AI's top choice. Basically, they looked at games, went to the point where where it was a new move relative to all the games in the past, and then narrowed it down to the ones that that weren't the best. It was like a novel but not optimal move, and the number of those increased after the model came out. So it's like people are learning a different way of thinking about the game and a different way of going about the challenge from these models, which is really remarkable.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of implications for future of work there. And I think what's cool is, to your point, you guys are kind of hiring people who are cool with experimenting. You're getting crazy adoption on it, and you have this little lens into kind of where the puck's going here a little bit, not to be too much business school professor, but that's sort of what it feels like to me. So I guess it feels like an important question then is like, where do you see mChat going and this kind of within Moderna?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the point of mChat really was to be able to enable going where the puck was heading, right? Like there weren't really any options like that when it came out. That landscape is changing. In fact, it would be disconcerting to be a entrepreneur in this space in some ways, because if the models get that much better, there can be entire sort of products that basically are just like not needed anymore. You've like compensated for being on a point earlier in the capability curve with all this extra engineering, and then you're just like past it. I think we're interested in really enabling exploration. And so, I mean, mChat has been really successful across the company, but I think the highest value sort of use cases are those that we can unlock with data science and software development internally. And so I think, moving forward, I like to think of a lot of my customers, so to speak, as the data scientists, developers, and power users inside of the company, and the people on the edge that are like, oh, if I only had access to my data, or if I only could, just automatically talk about what is in the web page that I'm on right now with these models, then I could have a different way of working. And so, that's, I think, what we're hoping to focus on. We are excited about ChatGPT Enterprise, which in a lot of ways is very similar and has a lot of overlap with mChat. And I think can essentially kind of unburden my very small engineering team from supporting a general purpose sort of product and allow us to focus on really high value Moderna specific applications and enabling those. So I think that's where it's going. But at the same time, there's still a lot of work along the AI transformation. And I think that's going to continue. That doesn't go away as the model as the models improve or as the technology improves. I think, where ChatGPT Enterprise has things like code interpreter, so it can run the code that it generates. Like, well, for a seasoned programmer, that's like handy and like kind of, not something better than cute, but not necessarily like game changing. But for people that can't program, that's crazy.
Right.
But then it comes back to like evaluating the accuracy or the truthfulness of what it's generating, right? I think a lot of what data scientists learn as they progress is to like kind of how to double check yourself, when things are too good to be true,
Yep.
like what to look out for in the data, what to look out, like how that manifests in graphs and visualizations and stuff. And that's not training that everyone has, but it's going to be training that more and more people are going to need as these capabilities are unlocked for them.
So I think that's 100% true. I also think there was a hint in there for entrepreneurs who are building in this space that I don't know if you intentionally did this or you just sort of were just talking and it just happened. But your point is a good one, right? Like a thin layer on top of these models is probably not that defensible. And you're playing in an ecosystem where businesses are literally worth $100 billion and they're making progress on a scale that's really fast, and the models are going to get better and better, and like AI basically forever. These things. So where do you play if you're an entrepreneur, right? How do you avoid this kind of recurring bitter lesson if you're an entrepreneur here?
Yeah, they're not to underestimate the importance of a well-designed product. I think probably the classic example of this is like the iPod, right? I had an MP3 player before an iPod,
Right.
but that like broke open the category in a different sort of way. But I think the real moat here is the models.
Yep.
Right. They cost so much to train, and I think that's hard to compete. So it's about how you use these models, breaking into a certain domain with that you're very much an expert at, and like using their capabilities in a way that the rest of the field is like just completely clueless about. I think a lot of those ideas, like it's going to be hard to, I think, have a successful product on the technology for the technology's sake eventually. Like there's companies like Microsoft or Apple, they're going to have LLMs just like it's going to be a proportion of how you use a computer, and they're going to have more resources to be able to build better models than you can imagine. But there's just a really long tail of high value sort of domain specific use cases. And, that's the type of thing that we're hoping to enable at Moderna. I think one thing that these models have really unlocked is text as a substrate to like work on in a way that other models haven't. And it has a lot of written text, like everything associated with clinical trials and regulatory filings, right? Like the filings, the BLA, which is biological license agreement, it's the last thing you need to basically so that the FDA lets you sell a drug. This includes like every description of every side effect you have in all of the clinical trials, right? And these are like 30,000 people clinical trials. It's thousands and thousands of pages. How do you, and we're going to have to confront that reality over and over and over again. Like it's pretty clear from my perspective that the, mRNA works great for vaccines. And so then the technical scientific barriers are low,
right?
Like the regulatory barriers are relatively high, and they should be high because we're putting this into people. But at the same time, here's this technology that can help speed that up and enable due diligence and enable the oversight that you would need from a regulatory perspective, but not actually have it take as long. Regulations I don't think exist to slow things down. They're just to make sure that we're sure, right? And if you can be as sure, but do it half as fast or twice as fast, then great. You get vaccines into people sooner. You save a ton of lives. And so that Moderna as a company is kind of entering this time where, we have one commercial product and we're in the late stage clinical trials for several more. And a lot of what's between our science and affecting human health is clinical trials and getting that process through there. So I think that's this is an example of a domain that, data scientists at Moderna have a real opportunity to be able to use this new technology in a very specific sort of way, and very high value sort of use cases, to make real impact and get drugs out to people sooner.
First of all, as every time when I talk to you, like the mission part of Moderna rang through there, and that was awesome, and I think that is unique to the culture there. But leaving that part aside, I think generally for entrepreneurs, the journey that your team is going through with mChat is probably the journey they're going to need to go through as well, right? Okay, just a slightly better way to send text to the OpenAI API is probably not a thing that people will buy from them in the future. But these more job specific, using the data specific, I think there's a real roadmap there for companies who are like, oh, I've gotten started. Where do I go? Even the prompt on think about when you're on a web page and how do you interact? There's unique things I think that entrepreneurs need to think about.
When people ask what the most important thing in a AI or ML or data science project is, the answer is almost always data.
Sure.
Right. And it's it's a little boring, but it's real. And it is still hard despite all the efforts out there and all the promises about being able to go from unstructured to structured data. You could in some cases, but generally it's too unstructured. If that really truly falls away and you can have a machine loop over the raw files and be able to build structured, accurate data out of it, that's going to change a lot of things. That'll change a lot of things for a lot of people. And I think that's an incredibly difficult problem. But at least if you extrapolate out, I think, you could imagine better and better versions of that are getting closer and closer. And it's going to take a lot of work to get there, but I think there's a lot of value there for entrepreneurs to think about. If there is a type of unstructured data that really, really well for a specific part of the business world,
yeah.
If you can solve it using a large language model, just in this sort of world that you're in, you're gonna have value, because that'll probably have to be done over and over and over again for different business domains.
I think that's 100% correct. Okay, so I'm already actually over my target recording length here, but this has been really fun. Let me ask you one last question to sort of wrap us up, though, and then we'll get just kind of a throwaway at the end. But so leaving generative AI aside and just thinking about sort of broadly about data science and AI, right? What do you think are the big trends that people in AI and healthcare need to be following for these next couple of years?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, LLMs were just at the dawn of what they can do. So I think that's an obvious, easy one. I think explainability and fairness. I often have less issues with explainability than my stakeholders do, but I think in the context of healthcare, this is really important.
Yep.
Right. Especially if you are leveraging these models to do things like suggest a certain course of drugs or treatment or something, you need to be able to walk that back and understand that, and it'll benefit everything once we get there. But that's certainly one. I think in the use in large sort of ML models with a lot of electronic medical record, I think looking at bias, for race and sex and stuff like that is a really big deal, and accounting for it. There's really good work that is tackling that, and those are very hard technical problems to unravel to make the most of that data. So yeah, I mean, I think that those are in general the big pieces. I think there's, on the more research side, there's a lot of stuff going on in regards to, like drug discovery and stuff like that. And I think if you're more scientifically minded, there's a wealth of stuff there. But yeah, there's really not a piece of the entire healthcare system that's not going to be affected by these technologies over the next, X years. So you could probably just throw a dart at the board and there'd be something worthwhile and something important to follow.
Awesome. Well, let me, to wrap up, I guess, for people who want to kind of stay aware of what you're doing, learn, what's the best social media platform to follow you on, or whatever the correct verb is?
Yeah. I mean, I've become more and more of a passive Twitter or X user, but that's probably the platform I'm most active on. My handle is just my last name, Giessel. I do a lot of sort of bookmarking, and I get a lot of my science and computer science information there. So, you can go in and check that out and browse and see what I've been reading and stuff. And you can always reach out there too. But that's probably the platform I use the most. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn, and for more of the sort of like business related stuff, that would be the place to go.
Okay. So we'll make sure both those are in the show notes and encourage everybody to follow Andrew on both those platforms. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. I really appreciate it. This was awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much for following along on this whole season, looking at generative AI and innovation. If you haven't listened to all of our episodes, I'd encourage you to go back and either watch or listen to them. They're available on your favorite podcasting platform and also on YouTube as a playlist on YouTube. I've really enjoyed these conversations, and frankly, it's complemented a lot of the really interesting work I've been doing as one of Carnegie Mellon's generative AI fellows at the Center for Intelligent Business. I'm going to take a little pause from recording podcasts here and actually put my head down and start building some stuff kind of adjacent to what we've been talking about here. Just really want to try to not just talk about this, but actually create some things. Please follow me on Twitter, or I guess it's X now, and LinkedIn to stay up to date on all the stuff that I'm building. And we'll be back with another season of Agile Giants soon.